The courtroom was dead silent when the bailiff announced, "Admiral Reyna Valdez has arrived." I'll never forget the sound of that judge's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up and saluted me, while my own family sat there with their jaws on the ground, realizing they'd been fighting the wrong person all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts 32 years earlier in a cramped two-bedroom house in Millbrook Heights, where I learned that being the responsible one meant being invisible. The Castillo family had a simple formula that never changed. My older brother Diego got the praise, my younger sister Carmen got the excuses, and I got the chores. That was our ecosystem. Diego could bring home mediocre grades, and Dad would slap his back, talking about how boys just needed time to find their stride. Carmen could skip school for a week straight, and Mom would blame the teachers for not making classes interesting enough. But when I came home with perfect attendance, honor roll certificates, and captain of the debate team, they'd nod politely and ask if I'd remembered to pick up milk on the way home. I should have seen the pattern earlier, but when you're living in it, dysfunction feels normal. Christmas mornings were the worst. Diego would unwrap a new gaming console that cost more than Mom made in 2 weeks, and everyone would cheer like he just won the lottery. Carmen got designer clothes that she'd wear once before tossing in the back of her closet. I'd open my gift to find practical things. A calculator for school, sensible shoes, or once, memorably, a pack of notebooks with a sticky note that said, "For all your studying." Dad actually said, "Well, at least you'll use those," like utility was the highest compliment he could give me. The military wasn't an escape plan back then. It was survival instinct. By senior year of high school, I'd realized that no matter what I achieved at home, I'd always be background noise in the Castillo family symphony. The Navy recruiter came to our school on a Tuesday, and I signed up that same afternoon. Not because I was particularly patriotic, though I grew to be, but because I needed to find a place where competence mattered more than family politics. Basic training at Naval Station Great Lakes was brutal, but it was honest. When you screwed up, they told you. When you excelled, they noticed. For the first time in my life, my achievements belonged to me. I wasn't competing with Diego's potential or Carmen's drama. I was just Seaman Recruit Castillo, and what I did or didn't do was on me alone. The day I graduated boot camp, I called home expecting maybe a little pride in my mother's voice. Instead, I got, "That's nice, mija. Hey, can you send some money? Diego's car broke down and he needs it fixed for his job interviews." That was the moment I realized that even wearing the uniform of the United States Navy, I was still just the family ATM to them. But the Navy saw something different. They saw a young woman who could organize chaos, who thought 3 steps ahead, who could make hard decisions under pressure. Leadership came naturally to me. Probably because I've been managing my family's crises since I was 12. The difference was that in the Navy, that skill was valued instead of exploited. I threw myself into my career with the kind of focus that only comes from finally finding your place in the world. Officer candidate school, Naval War College, command positions that took me from destroyers to aircraft carriers to eventually the Pentagon. Each promotion was earned through sleepless nights, flawless execution, and the kind of dedication that my family back in Millbrook Heights couldn't begin to understand. They'd see me maybe twice a year when I was on leave, always asking the same questions. When are you going to get a real job? Don't you want to settle down and have kids? This military thing is fine for a while, but what's your actual plan? They talked about my 20-year career like it was an extended vacation from real life. Diego, meanwhile, had bounced between jobs like a pinball, each failure explained away by circumstances beyond his control. Bad economy, difficult bosses, companies that just didn't appreciate his vision. Carmen had married young, divorced younger, and was on husband number 3 while living off alimony and family bailouts. But somehow, in the Castillo family narrative, They were the ones living authentic lives while I was playing dress up in a uniform. The irony was that every promotion, every commendation, every successful mission made the gap wider. The higher I rose in rank, the smaller I seemed to become in their eyes. By the time I made captain, they'd stopped asking about my work entirely. It was easier to ignore my success than to acknowledge they'd completely misjudged their own daughter.
The breaking point came, as these things often do, over money. Specifically, over the family house that my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1952. When he died, he left it to all 4 grandchildren equally, but with one catch. It couldn't be sold unless all 4 of us agreed. Diego and Carmen saw dollar signs. I saw the last piece of family history that actually meant something. That's how I ended up in Judge Morrison's courtroom on a Tuesday morning in October, watching my own brother and sister try to legally force me to sell the only thing our family had ever built that lasted. They thought they were fighting their quiet, compliant sister who'd always given in before. They had no idea they were about to face Admiral Reyna Valdez, United States Navy. And neither did I until the moment my service record was read aloud in that courtroom, and everything changed. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The law office of Patterson and Associates had that sterile smell of air freshener trying to mask old coffee and stress sweat. I'd driven 6 hours from Norfolk Naval Base to Millbrook Heights for what Diego had called a simple family meeting about Grandpa's house. Simple. That should have been my first red flag. I walked in wearing my dress blues because I'd come straight from a ceremony honoring fallen sailors. The uniform felt right. Formal and respectful for what I thought would be a discussion about preserving our grandfather's legacy. Diego took one look at me and rolled his eyes. Jesus, Reyna, did you have to come in costume? This isn't a parade. Carmen was already seated, flipping through her phone like she had somewhere more important to be. She glanced up long enough to smirk. Nice outfit. Very official. The way she said it made it clear she thought I was showing off. Our parents sat at the far end of the conference table, Mom wringing her hands and Dad staring at the ceiling like he wished he was anywhere else. Mr. Patterson, the family lawyer, shuffled papers nervously. Something about his expression told me this wasn't going to be the respectful discussion I'd anticipated. "All right," Diego said, sliding into the chair across from me like he was running the meeting. "Let's get this sorted out. We all know why we're here." I didn't, actually. But I waited. Diego continued, pulling out a real estate assessment like he was revealing a winning lottery ticket. The house is worth $420,000. Split 4 ways, that's over $100,000 each. Carmen and I have already talked to a realtor. We can have it listed by next week. The words hit me like a physical blow. Listed? Diego, we talked about this last Christmas. I told you I wanted to keep the house in the family. Carmen looked up from her phone, annoyed. Reyna, be realistic. What are you going to do with the house in Millbrook Heights? You're never here anyway. You're always off playing sailor somewhere. Playing sailor. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. 23 years of service, deployments to the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, command of ships worth more than this entire town's annual budget. And to my sister, it was playing. I'm not playing anything, I said quietly. And Grandpa built that house for the family to keep, not to sell the moment he wasn't around to stop us. Diego slammed his hand on the table. That familiar smirk spreading across his face, the same one he'd worn when he told his friends I was just the smart one back in high school. Look, I get that you're sentimental about it, but let's be practical here. What has that house ever really meant to you? You visit maybe twice a year? Carmen and I actually live here. We understand what the money could do for our lives. What the money could do for your lives? I corrected. Like the $15,000 I sent when your restaurant failed, or the $10,000 for Carmen's divorce lawyer, or the $25,000 for Mom and Dad's medical bills last year. The room went quiet. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. That's different, Carmen said, her voice getting that defensive edge it always took when someone called out her pattern of borrowing and never paying back. Those were emergencies. This is business. Everything's an emergency with you two, I said. But the one thing that actually has meaning, the one thing Grandpa specifically said he wanted to stay in the family, that's just business? Diego slammed his hand on the table. Don't you dare lecture us about family, Reyna. You chose the military over us a long time ago. You chose your precious career over being here when we needed you. The accuse was so backwards, it was almost funny. Almost. When you needed me? I've been here every time you needed me. Financially, emotionally, practically. The only time I wasn't here was when I was serving my country. Serving your country, Carmen repeated, making air quotes with her fingers. How noble. Meanwhile, the rest of us had to deal with real life. That was the moment something snapped inside me. Not explosively, not dramatically, more like a cable under tension finally reaching its breaking point and going quiet. Carmen had just dismissed 2 decades of military service as not real life. Diego was treating our grandfather's legacy like a commodity to be liquidated, and they were doing it while sitting across from someone who'd spent the morning honoring dead heroes.
I stood up slowly, my dress blues crisp and perfectly pressed. The uniform that my family saw as a costume. The uniform that represented every sacrifice I'd made. Every time I'd chosen duty over comfort. Every moment I'd put something larger than myself first. You want to know what's real life? I asked, my voice steady and cold. Real life is making decisions that affect thousands of people. Real life is being responsible for billion-dollar assets in human lives. Real life is understanding that some things matter more than immediate gratification. Diego rolled his eyes again. Here we go with the military speech. No, I said, pulling out my phone. Here we go with the legal reality check. I scrolled to the photos I'd taken of Grandpa's will just an hour earlier, when Mr. Patterson had finally let me review the original document. The clause that Diego and Carmen had conveniently forgotten to mention. The clause that required unanimous consent for any sale, but also gave any family member the right to buy out the others at assessed value, if they objected to a sale. I'm exercising my right of first refusal, I said, placing the phone on the table so everyone could see the highlighted section. I'll buy out your shares at full market value. The house stays in the family. The silence that followed was deafening. Diego's smirk vanished. Carmen's mouth fell open. Mom looked confused, and Dad leaned forward to read the phone screen. You can't do that, Diego said, but his voice had lost its confidence. I can, I replied, and I will. Mr. Patterson, please prepare the paperwork. I'll have the funds transferred by Friday. Where the hell are you going to get $400,000? Carmen demanded. I looked at her for a long moment. This sister who thought my career was pretend, who saw my uniform as a costume, who had just dismissed my service as not real life. I'm from my very fake, very pretend, not real life military salary, I said, the one I've been saving instead of spending on failed restaurants and multiple divorces. Diego's face turned red. You think you're better than us because you wear a uniform? I think I'm different than you because I understand what honor means, I replied. That's when Carmen stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, her voice rising to that shrill pitch it always hit when she didn't get her way. You know what? Fine. Take the stupid house. Sit in it by yourself and think about how you chose some military fantasy over your real family. But don't expect us to pretend we're proud of you anymore. The words were meant to hurt. They were meant to make me doubt myself, to make me feel guilty for not giving them what they wanted. Instead, they felt like liberation. I stopped expecting you to be proud of me a long time ago. The question is whether I can be proud of you. And with that, I walked out of the law office, leaving my family to figure out what it meant to fight someone who actually knew how to win. The drive back to Norfolk gave me 6 hours to think, and by the time I pulled through the gates of the naval base, I'd made a decision that would change everything, not just about the house, but about my entire relationship with the Castillo family. The base felt like coming home after visiting a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. Here, people stood when officers entered the room. Here, my uniform meant something. Here, respect wasn't something you begged for, it was earned and given freely. I sat in my office that night, still in my dress blues, staring at the commendations on my wall and thinking about Carmen's sneering voice calling my career a fantasy. Commander Sarah Mitchell knocked on my door around 2100 hours. She was my executive officer, sharp as a blade, and one of the few people who'd earned my complete trust over the years. Permission to speak freely, Admiral? I looked up, realizing she'd used my rank. Most people on base just called me captain, since that's what I'd been when I'd served with most of them. But Sarah knew. She'd been read in on the promotion that hadn't been announced yet. Always, Sarah. You look like someone just declared war on your hometown. She settled into the chair across from my desk. Want to talk about it? That's when it hit me. Sarah knew exactly who I was. She knew about the classified operations I'd led, the task forces I'd commanded, the Pentagon briefings where I was often the only woman in the room. She knew because she had been there, watching me earn every stripe, every star, every moment of recognition that my family would never understand. My family thinks I'm playing dress-up, I said finally. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Your family thinks the woman who commanded the USS Thunderbolt through the Strait of Hormuz crisis is playing dress-up? They don't know about the Thunderbolt. They don't know about any of it. And that was the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I'd kept my military achievements separate from my parent life, thinking it would somehow make coming home easier. Instead, it had made me invisible in both worlds. At home, I was just Reyna who sent checks. At work, I was Captain Valdez, who never talked about her personal life. Admiral, Sarah said quietly, permission to point out the obvious? I nodded. You're about to be promoted to Rear Admiral. You're 44 years old. You've commanded ships, led international task forces, and you have a direct line to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Why are you letting people who couldn't manage a lemonade stand make you question your worth? She was right, but it wasn't that simple. Because they're family.
No, Sarah said firmly. DNA doesn't make people family. Respect does. Trust does. Support does. From what you've told me over the years, your family has never given you any of those things. I leaned back in my chair, feeling something settle into place. A clarity I hadn't felt since walking out of that law office. So what do you suggest? Stop hiding who you are, she said. Stop protecting them from the truth about what you've accomplished. Stop making yourself smaller so they can feel bigger. That night, I stayed up late researching property law and inheritance disputes. Not because I needed to understand my legal rights, I'd already figured those out, but because I was planning something bigger than just buying a house. I was planning to stop being invisible. The first step was practical. The house purchase would go through, but not quietly. I contacted the best real estate attorney in Virginia, someone who specialized in high-profile cases. I wasn't going to handle this through Mr. Patterson's small-town practice. I was going to make sure every document, every transfer, every legal step was bulletproof and very, very public. The second step was personal. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. Admiral James Harrison, my mentor from the War College, Captain Linda Torres, who'd served under me on the Thunderbolt, Colonel Michael Chen from Joint Operations Planning. These were people who knew my real value, who'd seen me make decisions under pressure that my siblings couldn't imagine. I started making calls. Jim, it's Reyna Valdez. I need a favor. I'm having some legal issues with my family, and I think it's time they understood exactly who they're dealing with. Admiral Harrison's laugh was warm and knowing. About damn time, Admiral. What do you need? By Thursday morning, I had a team assembled that would have impressed the Pentagon. Not because I was calling in favors for personal gain, but because I was finally done pretending that my achievements didn't matter. These people respected me professionally, and they understood that sometimes respect has to be demanded, not requested. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. When the property transfer went to court, and Diego and Carmen would absolutely force it to court because they couldn't stand losing, I wouldn't be represented by some local attorney. I'd walk in with the kind of legal firepower that usually handled international maritime law and defense contracts. But more importantly, I'd walk in as myself, not as the quiet sister who sent Christmas checks and avoided conflict, as Rear Admiral Reyna Valdez, United States Navy, with my full service record, my security clearances, my commendations, and my real career laid out for everyone to see. I called Captain Torres next. Linda, I need you to pull together my complete service jacket. Everything that's not classified. I want a full documentation of every command, every operation, every mission I've led over the past 23 years. Ma'am, is this for a promotion board? No, I said. It's for a family who's about to learn that their daughter isn't who they thought she was. The weekend was spent in preparation. I drafted letters to my family, not angry letters, but factual ones. Letters that laid out exactly what my military service had entailed, what my rank actually meant, what responsibilities I carried every single day. Letters that explained why their dismissive comments weren't just hurtful, they were insulting to every sailor who'd ever served under my command. But I wouldn't send those letters yet. First, they needed to see what it looked like when someone stopped making themselves small for their comfort. Commander Mitchell stopped by my office on Sunday evening. The legal team is ready, Admiral. They're excited, actually. Apparently, it's not often they get to work a case where they can show off their credentials in civilian court. And the service record documentation? Complete. Torres did an outstanding job. 23 years of service, 12 major commendations, command of 4 different vessels, leadership in 3 international operations that most civilians have never heard of, but definitely should have had. She paused. Admiral, when this goes public, it's going to be big news in the military community. Everyone is going to know that your family tried to push around a flag officer. That thought should have worried me. Instead, it felt like justice. Good, I said. Let them see what happens when you underestimate someone who spent their entire career managing real stakes. I spent that Sunday night polishing my dress uniform, not because I was vain, but because I understood the power of symbols. When I walked into that courtroom, I wanted everyone, my family, the judge, the court reporter, every person in that room to understand exactly who they were looking at. For 23 years, I'd worn this uniform with honor. For 23 years, I'd made decisions that affected real lives, real missions, real outcomes. And for 23 years, my own family had treated me like I was playing make-believe. That was about to change. The decision wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about finally, after decades of being invisible, stepping into the light and letting everyone see what they'd been too blind to notice. My family wanted to fight me over a house? Fine. But they were about to learn that they'd picked a fight with someone who understood what real battles looked like. And unlike the playground squabbles they were used to, this was one I intended to win. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment my family decided I was invisible. I was 14, sitting at the dinner table with a certificate from the National Merit Scholarship Program. Top 1% in the state. Full ride opportunities to any college I wanted. I placed it next to my plate, waiting for someone to notice.
Diego had just bombed his sophomore year of high school. Again. Dad was giving him the "everyone learns at their own pace" speech while Mom nodded sympathetically. Carmen was 13 and had been caught shoplifting makeup from the drugstore, but somehow that had turned into a discussion about peer pressure and how society made girls feel bad about themselves. I waited through the entire dinner. The certificate sat there, crisp and official, while my family debated whether Diego needed a tutor or just more encouragement. Finally, as Mom started clearing plates, she picked up my certificate, glanced at it, and said, "That's nice, honey. Very responsible of you." Then she used it as a coaster for Dad's coffee cup. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. In the Castillo family hierarchy, achievement was suspicious. Success was threatening. Being good at something meant you were showing off, and showing off meant you thought you were better than everyone else. So I learned to hide. When I made valedictorian, I told them it was just alphabetical. When I got into the Naval Academy with a full scholarship, I downplayed it as just wanting to try something different. When I graduated with honors, I mentioned it casually during a phone call home and changed the subject when they didn't respond. The pattern started early and ran deep. Carmen could fail 3 classes and get sympathy for having a learning disability. Diego could lose job after job and get understanding for being unlucky with employers. But if I excelled at anything, I was being a perfectionist, showing off, making them look bad. The military academy was my first taste of what life could be like when competence was valued instead of hidden. Plebe year was hell, but it was honest hell. When upperclassmen screamed at you, it was because you'd made a mistake, not because your success made them uncomfortable. When you did something right, you got recognition. When you did something exceptional, you got responsibility. I thrived in that environment in ways that should have told my family everything they needed to know about who their daughter really was. But I kept the details to myself, partly because they wouldn't have understood, and partly because I'd learned that my achievements made family gatherings tense. During my second year at Annapolis, I called home after making brigade commander. It was the highest leadership position a midshipman could hold, responsible for over 4,000 future naval officers. The selection process was brutal, based on academics, military performance, and leadership evaluations from both peers and superiors. "That's nice, mija," Mom said when I told her. "Your brother got promoted to assistant manager at the auto parts store." The conversation lasted 15 minutes. 12 of those minutes were about Diego's new responsibilities, counting inventory and handling difficult customers. 3 minutes were about my achievement, commanding more people than lived in our entire hometown. I stopped calling with good news after that. The pattern continued through my entire military career. When I made lieutenant, they asked when I was going to get a real job. When I got my first ship command, they wanted to know if that meant I'd finally be stationed somewhere normal. When I was selected for the War College, Dad asked if that was like going back to school because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Each promotion brought more responsibility, more recognition from my peers, and more bewilderment from my family. By the time I made commander, I'd led operations in 3 different theaters, managed budgets larger than most corporations, and earned commendations that most officers never see in a full career. At Christmas, they introduced me to neighbors as Reyna, who's still in the Navy. Still in the Navy. Like it was a phase I was going through. The worst part wasn't the dismissal, it was the active undermining. When I'd come home on leave, Diego would make jokes about me being too good for civilian life. Carmen would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned work, saying things like, "We get it, you're important." Mom would change the subject whenever I tried to share anything about my career, steering conversations toward Diego's latest job search or Carmen's relationship drama. They trained me to make myself smaller every time I walked through their door. I'd catch myself speaking more quietly, choosing my words carefully, avoiding any mention of my actual responsibilities. I became a part-time version of myself when I was home, careful never to seem too competent, too confident, or too successful. The irony was that the higher I rose in rank, the more they seemed to think my career was a hobby. When I made captain at 36, the youngest female captain in my class, they seemed genuinely confused about why I was still playing soldier instead of settling down. Mom started sending me newspaper clippings about women my age getting married and having babies, like she was dropping hints about what my real priorities should be. What they never understood was that I wasn't playing anything. While Diego was bouncing between entry-level jobs and Carmen was collecting husbands, I was commanding destroyers through contested waters, managing international naval exercises, and making decisions that affected American foreign policy. But I never told them that. I never explained that their daughter was briefing admirals, that foreign diplomats knew my name, that my signature authorized operations most civilians would never hear about. I kept my two worlds completely separate, thinking I was protecting them from feeling inadequate. Instead, I was protecting them from seeing who I really was.
The breaking point should have come years earlier. Maybe when I was 30 and commanding my first ship, when Diego asked if I was still doing that Navy thing. Maybe when I was 35 and Carmen rolled her eyes at my dress uniform, calling it so dramatic. Maybe when I was 40 and Dad introduced me to his friends as our daughter who never got married. But it didn't. I kept making myself smaller, kept hiding my achievements, kept pretending that my career was just something I did instead of something I was. I let them think I was the family member who'd never quite figured out how to live a normal life, who was compensating for some personal inadequacy by playing soldier. The house wasn't really about the house. It was about 23 years of being dismissed, minimized, and misunderstood by the people who should have been proudest of what I'd become. It was about watching Diego and Carmen demand respect they'd never earned while I hid accomplishments that spoke for themselves. Sitting in that law office, listening to Carmen call my career a fantasy, I realized I'd been complicit in my own invisibility. I'd taught them not to see me by carefully hiding everything worth seeing. I'd protected their egos by diminishing my own achievements. But protection was a two-way street. And if they couldn't handle the truth about who their daughter had become, that wasn't my responsibility anymore. The little girl who hid her merit scholarship certificate so her siblings wouldn't feel bad was gone. In her place was a woman who'd earned the right to be seen, respected, and acknowledged for exactly who she was. It was time my family met Rear Admiral Reyna Valdez, and if that made them uncomfortable, they'd have to learn to live with the discomfort. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a military campaign, because that's exactly what it was. I'd spent my career planning operations where failure meant lives lost and missions compromised. This was different stakes, but the same principles. Intelligence gathering, resource allocation, timing, and overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Step 1 was assembling the team. Admiral Harrison connected me with Rebecca Stone, a maritime law specialist who'd handled cases for the Pentagon and 3 different federal agencies. She was the kind of attorney who charged $1,000 an hour and was worth every penny. When I called her office, I didn't introduce myself as Reyna Castillo having a family dispute. I introduced myself as Rear Admiral Valdez, requesting consultation on a legal matter involving inheritance law and potential fraud. The difference in response was immediate. "Admiral, I can see you this afternoon," her assistant said. "Miss Stone has cleared her schedule." That afternoon, I sat in her downtown Norfolk office wearing my service dress blues, my ribbons and decorations visible, my bearing unmistakably military. Rebecca Stone was in her 50s, sharp-eyed with the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. "Admiral, I've reviewed the preliminary documents you sent," she said, settling behind her desk. "Your siblings are trying to force a sale of inherited property, claiming financial hardship and family necessity. Standard inheritance dispute. Except for one problem." "Which is?" She smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "They're trying to financially coerce a flag officer." "That's not just stupid, Admiral. That's potentially criminal, depending on how far they push it." I leaned forward. "Explain that." "If they know about your security clearances, your access to classified information, your position within the military hierarchy, and they're deliberately creating financial pressure to influence your decisions, that crosses several federal lines. Even if they don't know, their ignorance won't protect them once they're educated about who they're dealing with." Rebecca pulled out a thick folder. "I've been researching your family, Admiral. Your brother Diego has filed for bankruptcy twice, has 3 liens against him, and owes back taxes in 2 states. Your sister Carmen has defaulted on credit cards, had wages garnished, and is currently facing foreclosure on her condo. Your parents have medical debt exceeding $40,000. The picture was worse than I'd known. So this isn't just about wanting money. This is about desperate people who see you as their solution. They've convinced themselves that you owe them this bailout because you're family. What they don't understand is that you're not just family. You're a senior military officer with responsibilities that supersede their financial crisis." Step 2 was documentation.
Captain Torres had assembled my complete service record, but I needed more than that. I needed context. I called in favors from colleagues who understood exactly what my career represented. Commander Patricia Wells from Naval Intelligence prepared a civilian-friendly summary of my security clearances and access levels. Captain Robert Park from the Joint Chiefs Staff Office documented my involvement in classified operations that had shaped American maritime policy. None of it was classified information, but all of it was impressive as hell. "Admiral," Captain Park said during our secure call, "when this goes public, it's going to make waves. The military community doesn't like it when flag officers get disrespected by their own families. You might find yourself with more support than you expected." Step 3 was timing. I knew my family well enough to predict their next moves. Diego would get impatient with the legal process and try to pressure me directly. Carmen would attempt emotional manipulation, probably involving mom and dad. They'd escalate to conflict because they couldn't conceive of losing to their quiet sister. I wanted them to escalate. I wanted them to make this as public and as messy as possible because the bigger the stage, the more spectacular their education would be.
Meanwhile, I maintained absolute operational security. I didn't tell my family about the legal team I'd assembled. I didn't mention my promotion to Rear Admiral, which was still awaiting official announcement. I certainly didn't explain that their financial desperation was about to collide with someone who had direct access to the Secretary of the Navy. Instead, I played my role perfectly. I answered their increasingly frantic calls with calm professionalism. When Diego demanded to know why the property transfer was taking so long, I told him legal processes were complex. When Carmen accused me of stalling, I reminded her that she was the one who'd insisted on going through courts instead of handling it privately. "You want this done officially," I told her during one particularly heated phone call. "Official takes time." What I didn't tell her was that official also meant public record. Every document filed in this case would be available to anyone who cared to look, including the military community that followed flag officer news, the Norfolk media that covered local legal disputes, and the Millbrook Heights gossip network that would absolutely lose their minds when they realized what the Castillo family had walked into. Step 4 was psychological preparation. Commander Mitchell helped me work through the emotional complexity of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about fundamentally changing my relationship with my family forever. "Admiral, you understand there's no going back from this," she said during one of our evening conversations. "Once they see who you really are, once the community sees how they've treated you, everything changes." "Good," I said. "It should have changed years ago." But she was right about the finality. I was about to burn bridges that had taken 44 years to build. I was about to expose my family's financial desperation and my own military achievements in the most public way possible. I was about to trade their comfortable dismissal of me for their permanent resentment. The question was whether I cared more about family harmony or personal dignity. And after 23 years of choosing harmony, I'd finally reached the point where dignity won. Step 5 was the reveal strategy itself. I wouldn't announce my promotion or my legal team in advance. I wouldn't warn them about what they were walking into. Instead, I'd let them dig themselves into the deepest hole possible, let them make their most dismissive comments on the public record, let them demonstrate exactly how little they understood about their own sister. Then, when they'd committed fully to their position, when they'd gone all in on treating me like the irresponsible family member who needed to be managed, I'd show them what a real power play looked like. Rebecca Stone called it the nuclear option. I called it justice. "Admiral," she said during our final planning session, "when we walk into that courtroom, we're not just representing your interests in a property dispute. We're making a statement about how this country treats its military leaders. Your family picked the wrong fight with the wrong person at the wrong time." I thought about Diego's smirk, Carmen's eye-rolling, their casual dismissal of my costume and my fantasy career. I thought about 23 years of hiding my achievements to protect their feelings,
23 years of making myself smaller so they could feel bigger. Rebecca, I said, I want to make sure they understand exactly what they've done. Not just to me, but to everyone who's ever served under my command. Every sailor who's trusted me with their lives, every operation I've led, every mission I've completed, they've been dismissing all of it. She nodded grimly. Admiral, by the time we're finished, they're going to understand that insulting you means insulting the United States Navy. And federal judges don't take kindly to that kind of disrespect. The planning phase was complete. The team was assembled. The strategy was set. Now all that remained was execution. My family thought they were fighting their quiet, compliant sister over a house. They had no idea they were about to face the full weight of the United States military legal system commanded by someone who'd never lost a battle that mattered. And this one mattered more than any of them. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing fleet readiness reports. Diego's voice was tight with frustration and barely contained anger. Reyna, what the hell are you doing? We got papers yesterday saying you're contesting the sale with some fancy Norfolk law firm. This was supposed to be simple. I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair, watching Norfolk Harbor through my office window. 3 destroyers for conducting training exercises, their movements precise and coordinated, like a well-executed plan coming together. It is simple, Diego. I'm exercising my legal rights under Grandpa's will, the same rights that were explained to all of us when we inherited the property. Rights? Since when do you care about rights? You've never fought us on anything before. That was the opening I'd been waiting for. The admission that my compliance had been expected, assumed, taken for granted. Maybe I should have fought you before. Maybe things would be different if I had. Look, we can work this out, he said, switching to the wheedling tone he used when he wanted something. Carmen and I talked about it. We can give you a bigger percentage, 35% instead of 25%, but we need this sale to happen. You need this sale to happen, I corrected. I need the house to stay in the family. We want different things, Diego, and wanting something doesn't mean you get to have it. The silence that followed was telling. Diego wasn't used to hearing no from me, wasn't used to resistance that couldn't be worn down with persistence or guilt.
Fine, he said finally. If you want to make this difficult, we'll see you in court, but don't expect us to be nice about it. I've never expected you to be nice about anything, I replied. That's never been our family's strong suit. I hung up and immediately called Rebecca Stone. It's time. They're escalating to court proceedings. How soon can we be ready? Admiral, we've been ready since last week. I'll file our response today. Your family is about to get their first taste of what happens when they pick a fight with someone who actually knows how to fight back. The next week unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. Carmen called crying, insisting that I was being selfish and destroying the family over money. Mom called pleading, asking why I couldn't just be reasonable like I had always been. Dad called confused, wondering why his quiet daughter was suddenly causing so much trouble. I answered every call with calm professionalism, never raising my voice, never getting emotional. I explained my position clearly. The house had sentimental value that exceeded its financial worth. I had the legal right to purchase their shares, and I intended to exercise that right regardless of their objections. What I didn't explain was the machinery I'd set in motion behind the scenes. Rebecca Stone had filed a response that was a masterpiece of legal precision. She'd included my complete service record as supporting documentation for my financial stability and character references. She'd attached statements from 3 different admirals attesting to my integrity and leadership. She'd documented every loan I'd made to family members over the years, every check I'd sent, every financial crisis I'd helped them weather. But most importantly, she'd done it all under my full military designation. Every document filed with the court identified me as Rear Admiral Reyna Valdez, United States Navy. Not Reyna Castillo, the compliant sister. Admiral Valdez, flag officer. The court date was set for the following month. I marked it on my calendar and continued my normal duties, knowing that my family had no idea what was coming. They thought they were dealing with their predictable sister who'd always given in eventually. They were preparing to face someone who didn't exist anymore. Commander Mitchell stopped by my office the day after the court documents were filed. "Admiral, you might want to see this." She handed me a printout from the Norfolk Naval Base newsletter. There, in the recent promotions section, was my photo and a brief announcement of my promotion to Rear Admiral. "The timing's perfect," she said. "This goes out to every military family in the region. By next week, half of Virginia will know there's a new flag officer in Norfolk, including everyone in Millbrook Heights who has military connections." That afternoon, I received 3 calls from local reporters wanting to interview the Navy's newest female Rear Admiral. I declined politely, but I could see the momentum building. My promotion wouldn't stay quiet for long, especially not with active court proceedings involving my civilian name. Meanwhile, my family's financial desperation was becoming more apparent. Diego had called twice more, each time sounding more frantic. Carmen had left voicemails that went from pleading to angry to threatening. She'd mentioned hiring her own lawyer, though I doubted she had the money for quality legal representation. The most telling call came from Dad. His voice was weaker than I remembered, tinged with something that might have been respect for the first time in decades. "Misha, I got some papers in the mail, legal papers with your name on them, but they say Admiral Valdez. I'm confused." I took a deep breath. This was the moment I could have explained everything, could have prepared him for what was coming. Instead, I chose truth, delivered with surgical precision. "Dad, those papers are correct. I was promoted to Rear Admiral 3 weeks ago. I'm the same person I've always been. You're just seeing it documented officially for the first time." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Rear Admiral," he said, finally. That's a big deal, isn't it?" "Yes, Dad, it's a very big deal." "Why didn't you tell us?" The question I had been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of everything wrong with our family dynamic. "When have you ever been interested in what I actually do for a living? When have any of you asked about my work in a way that suggested you wanted a real answer?" Another long silence. Then quietly, "Your brother and sister, they don't know about this yet." "No, they don't. They're going to find out in court, along with everyone else." "Reyna." He paused and I could hear him struggling with the implications. "They're going to be blindsided. They've been blindsiding me for 23 years, Dad. I think they can handle one surprise." After I hung up, I sat in my office watching the sun set over the naval base. Ships came and went. Sailors reported to duty. The massive machinery of the United States Navy continued its eternal mission of protecting American interests around the world. And somewhere in that vast organization, I had found my place, my purpose, my identity. It was an identity my family had never bothered to understand, had never thought to ask about, had dismissed as unimportant whenever it surfaced. But it was real, and it was mine, and it was about to collide with their comfortable illusions in the most public way possible. Rebecca Stone called that evening with an update. "Admiral, I've received contact from your sibling's attorney, Mr. Patterson from Millbrook Heights. He seems overwhelmed by the documentation we've provided. I don't think he's ever handled a case involving a flag officer." "What did he say?" "He asked if we were certain about your military rank. Apparently, your family told him you were just a regular Navy person, nothing special. He's requesting verification of your credentials."
I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Give them everything, Rebecca. Service record, security clearances, command history, the works. Let him explain to my family exactly who they've been fighting. Admiral, I should warn you, once we provide that documentation, this case is going to attract attention. Military legal disputes involving flag officers don't stay quiet for long." "Good," I said. "I'm tired of staying quiet." The implementation phase was complete. The legal machinery was in motion, grinding forward with the inexorable force of federal law and military protocol.
My family had wanted a simple sale of inherited property. Instead, they were about to get a very public education about the difference between the sister they thought they knew and the admiral they'd never bothered to meet. The courtroom date loomed ahead like an approaching storm, and I was ready for it. The first ripples started hitting Millbrook Heights 3 days after the court documents were filed. Mrs. Delilah Pacheco, who'd lived next door to my parents for 15 years and whose son served on a Navy destroyer, called my mother with a question that changed everything. "Elena, is it true that Reyna is an admiral in the Navy? My son Tommy saw something in the base newsletter about a Rear Admiral Valdez from this area, and the photo looked like your daughter." Mom called me within an hour, her voice shaking. "Mija, Mrs. Pacheco is asking questions about you being an admiral. I told her there must be some mistake, that you're just regular Navy, but she seems so sure." I was in my office at the Pentagon that day, attending a briefing on Pacific fleet readiness. The irony of my mother calling to ask if I was really an admiral, while I sat in a room full of admirals planning international naval strategy, wasn't lost on me. "There's no mistake, Mom. Mrs. Pacheco's son has accurate information." But you never said. I mean, admiral is important, right? Like, very important? "Yes, Mom. Admiral is very important." The silence that followed spoke volumes. In that pause, I could hear 23 years of assumptions crumbling. Every eye roll when I mentioned work, every dismissive comment about my Navy thing, every time they'd introduced me as their daughter who's still in the military. All of it was being recontextualized in real time. "Reyna, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't we know?" "Because you never asked. Because every time I tried to explain what I did, you changed the subject. Because you made it clear that my career was less interesting than Diego's job search or Carmen's relationship problems." I could hear her crying softly. Not the manipulative tears Carmen used as weapons, but genuine confusion and regret. "But we're proud of you. We've always been proud." "No, Mom. You've been proud of the idea of me. The daughter who was responsible and quiet and didn't cause problems. You've never been proud of who I actually am or what I've actually accomplished." Word spread through Millbrook Heights with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By the end of the week, I was getting calls from high school classmates I hadn't spoken to in decades, all wanting to congratulate me on my promotion and fish for details about what had really happened with my family. The most revealing call came from Maria Santos, who'd been Carmen's best friend in high school and still lived in town. "Reyna, I had to call you. Carmen's been telling everyone that there's some mistake about your rank, that you're exaggerating your position to impress the court. She's actually trying to convince people that you're lying about being an admiral." That stopped me cold. She's telling people I'm lying about my military rank? She said there's no way her sister could be that important without the family knowing about it. She's saying you probably just got some minor promotion and you're blowing it out of proportion to seem impressive for the lawsuit. Carmen was now publicly questioning my integrity, suggesting I was committing what amounted to military fraud. She was so committed to her narrative of me as the unimpressive sister that she'd rather believe I was lying about my career than accept that she'd been wrong about me for decades. That afternoon, I made a call I'd been avoiding. Admiral Patricia Harrison, Chief of Naval Personnel, was an old mentor who'd followed my career closely. She had also grown up in a military family and understood the unique challenges of balancing service with civilian relationships. "Admiral, I need advice. My family is publicly questioning my military rank. They're telling our hometown that I'm exaggerating my position for personal gain." Her response was immediate and sharp. "Admiral, that's not just disrespectful to you personally. That's an attack on your military credibility. Are you telling me that civilians are publicly questioning the integrity of a flag officer's service record? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Reyna, this goes beyond family drama. When civilians question an officer's rank and credentials publicly, especially during legal proceedings, it reflects on the entire military structure. The Navy doesn't take kindly to that kind of disrespect.
What followed was a conversation that made me realize I'd underestimated the ramifications of what my family had started. Patricia explained that questioning a flag officer's credentials wasn't just rude, it was potentially damaging to military morale and public confidence in the promotion system. I'm going to make some calls. The Norfolk media needs to understand who they're dealing with when they report on this case. And your family needs to understand that they're not just fighting you, they're disrespecting the United States Navy.
Meanwhile, back in Millbrook Heights, the social dynamics were shifting in ways my family hadn't anticipated. The Pacheco family, the Morales family, and 3 other families with military connections were rallying around what they saw as an attack on one of their own. Mrs. Pacheco had called her son Tommy, who'd served under my command briefly early in his career, and his response had been swift and decisive. "Ma'am, Admiral Valdez is the real deal. She's respected throughout the fleet. Anyone saying otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about." Tommy had apparently shared this information with his Navy buddies, who'd shared it with their families, who'd shared it with their neighbors. Within days, half the town knew that Carmen Castillo was publicly questioning the credibility of a legitimate rear admiral. The economic consequences started almost immediately. Diego's part-time construction work began drying up as contractors who employed military families decided they didn't want to be associated with someone disrespecting a flag officer. Carmen found herself uninvited to social events as military spouses closed ranks against what they perceived as an attack on their community. Even my parents felt the shift. Dad's weekly poker game with the guys from the VFW became uncomfortable as the other veterans made their feelings clear about family members who didn't support their own military children. Mom's church group began asking pointed questions about why the Castillo family seemed so hostile toward their daughter's naval service. The most telling moment came when Carmen tried to organize support for her version of events through social media. She posted a long, rambling explanation about family disputes and sister who'd gotten too big for her boots and was using military connections to bully her own family. The response was not what she'd expected. Veterans from across the region began commenting, sharing their own experiences serving under female flag officers, posting photos with me from various military events I'd forgotten about. The post, intended to generate sympathy for Carmen, instead became a tribute wall for my military service. One comment, from a retired Master Chief who'd served on the USS Thunderbolt during my command, particularly stung. "Ma'am, with respect, your sister saved my ship and crew during the Hormuz crisis. She's earned every stripe, every star, and every bit of respect she's ever received. Maybe the problem isn't that she's gotten too big for her boots. Maybe the problem is that your boots were never big enough to understand what she's been walking in." Carmen deleted the post within hours, but screenshots had already spread throughout military social media networks. She'd accidentally created a viral moment celebrating my career while exposing her own ignorance about what military service actually entailed. By the end of the second week, my family's position had become untenable. They weren't just fighting their sister anymore, they were fighting the military community, the veteran population, and anyone who understood that questioning a flag officer's credentials was a step too far. Diego called me on a Friday night, his voice strained. "Reyna, people at work are asking me about you. They're asking if it's true that my sister is an admiral and I didn't know it. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth, Diego. Tell them you never bothered to ask what your sister did for a living, so you never found out that she dedicated her life to serving her country." "But why didn't you tell us? Why did we have to find out from neighbors?" "Because every time I tried to tell you, you made it clear you weren't interested. Every time I mentioned my work, you changed the subject. Every time I achieved something, you found a way to minimize it." The consequences were cascading faster than any of them had anticipated. They'd wanted a simple property dispute with their quiet, compliant sister. Instead, they'd ignited a community-wide controversy about respect for military service, and they were on the wrong side of it. The court date was still 2 weeks away, but the battle lines were already drawn, and for the first time in their lives, my family was discovering what it felt like to be outgunned.
The Norfolk Virginian pilot ran the story on a Wednesday morning with a headline that made my coffee taste bitter. Local family disputes Navy admiral's credentials in inheritance case. The reporter, Sarah Chen, had done her homework. She'd interviewed 3 different naval historians, gotten quotes from the Secretary of the Navy's office, and somehow obtained statements from sailors who'd served under my command. The article was factual, professional, and devastating to my family's position. Rear Admiral Reyna Valdez, 44, is currently embroiled in a legal dispute with siblings who claim she has misrepresented her military rank to gain advantage in inheritance cases. The article began, Navy records confirm Admiral Valdez's promotion to flag rank 3 months ago, making her one of the youngest female rear admirals in current service. But the sidebar that really drove the knife home, Sarah Chen had compiled a timeline of my military career that read like a highlight reel. Youngest captain in my academy class, first female commanding officer of the USS Thunderbolt, recipient of the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, graduate of the Naval War College with highest honors, current assignment to Pacific Fleet Strategic Planning. The contrast between my documented achievements and my family's public dismissal of my career was stark enough to make anyone with basic reading comprehension uncomfortable. Carmen called me on 0630 hours, screaming into the phone before I'd even said hello. What did you do? How did you get the newspaper to write that hit piece about us? I didn't call them. Reporters tend to investigate stories involving flag officers and public disputes. It's called journalism. They made us look like idiots. No, Carmen, you made yourselves look like idiots. The newspaper just documented it.
Diego was more strategic in his response, but equally panicked. He'd retained a new lawyer, someone from Richmond who specialized in media relations and damage control. Apparently, the original attorney, Mr. Patterson, had recommended they find someone with experience handling high-profile cases. Diego, this needs to stop, Diego said during his call that afternoon. You're destroying our reputation in town. People are treating us like we're unpatriotic or something. Are you unpatriotic, Diego? Of course not, but when you publicly fight with a Navy admiral, people make assumptions. People make assumptions based on evidence, Diego, and the evidence is that you've spent your entire adult life dismissing your sister's military service as unimportant. The Richmond lawyer, James Morrison, called me directly the next day. His tone was professional but strained, like a man trying to negotiate his way out of a minefield. Admiral Valdez, I'm representing your siblings in the inheritance matter. I think there may be some misunderstandings we can clear up without further public attention. What misunderstandings would those be, Mr. Morrison? Well, I believe your family wasn't fully aware of your military achievements. Perhaps if we could arrange a private meeting, we could resolve this property dispute in a way that respects everyone's position. Mr. Morrison, my family's awareness of my military achievements isn't relevant to their legal rights under my grandfather's will. They want to force a sale. I'm exercising my right to prevent that sale. This is a simple matter of contract law. Admiral, surely you understand that continued media attention could be uncomfortable for everyone involved? That was when I realized what was really happening. Diego and Carmen weren't just embarrassed by the newspaper coverage, they were terrified of it. The story had already been picked up by military news outlets and veteran organizations. People were starting to ask questions about how a flag officer's own family could be so ignorant of her achievements. More importantly, they were starting to ask questions about how a family could publicly challenge the integrity of someone with security clearances and access to classified information. Admiral Patricia Harrison called me that evening with news that confirmed my suspicions. Reyna, I've been hearing from people in interesting places. The Secretary of the Navy's office wants to know if you need support in dealing with what they're calling civilian interference with military personnel. Civilian interference?
When family members publicly question an officer's credentials during legal proceedings, it raises questions about potential coercion, blackmail, or other forms of pressure that could compromise security protocols. The Pentagon doesn't like those kinds of questions. What she was telling me, in careful bureaucratic language, was that my family's actions had triggered security reviews. People with clearances higher than mine were now paying attention to the Castillo family's attempts to pressure a flag officer. The social media storm continued to intensify. Military spouses, veteran organizations, and active duty personnel were sharing my story as an example of the sacrifices military families make and the lack of recognition they often receive from their own relatives. Hashtag Support Admiral Valdez started trending in military circles. Carmen's attempt to control the narrative through her own social media had backfired so spectacularly that she'd deleted all her accounts. But the internet never forgets, and screenshots of her posts questioning my military rank were being shared as examples of civilian ignorance about military service. The most damaging development came from an unexpected source. Tommy Pacheco, Mrs. Pacheco's son, who'd served under my command, had shared the story with his current commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez of the USS Hampton. Captain Rodriguez had served with me during a joint operation in the Mediterranean and had strong opinions about family members who didn't support their military relatives. He'd written a letter to the editor of the Norfolk, Virginia Pilot that ran on Friday morning. I had the honor of serving alongside then-Captain Valdez during Operation Maritime Shield in 2019. Her leadership during that mission was exemplary, and her tactical decisions likely prevented an international incident. To see her own family question her military service and achievements is not just personally insulting, it's an insult to every sailor who has served under her command and trusted her with their lives. The letter included specific details about classified operations that had been declassified, painting a picture of my career that even I found impressive when seen laid out in print. Captain Rodriguez had essentially provided a character reference that carried the weight of the entire U.S. Navy. Diego's new strategy involved hiring a public relations firm to try to rehabilitate their image. They released a statement claiming the family dispute was a private matter that had been mischaracterized by media attention. They insisted they had always been proud of Reyna's military service and that any suggestion otherwise was a misunderstanding. The statement was professional, politically correct, and completely undermined by the public record of their own words and actions over the previous month. By Friday afternoon, the mayor of Millbrook Heights had issued a proclamation declaring the following week Military Appreciation Week in honor of our local heroes, including Rear Admiral Reyna Valdez. The timing wasn't coincidental. The mayor, a former Marine, was making a very public statement about which side of this dispute had the community's support. Mom called me that weekend, her voice small and defeated. Mija, people at church are asking me questions I don't know how to answer. They want to know why we didn't know about your promotions, why we weren't proud of your achievements. And what do you tell them, Mom? I tell them we are proud, but they ask why we never talked about it, why nobody in town knew you were so important in the Navy. And what do you say to that? I don't know what to say, Reyna, because I don't understand it myself. How did we not know? How did we miss all of this?
For the first time since this whole situation started, I heard genuine confusion and regret in my mother's voice. Not the defensive anger that Diego and Carmen wielded like weapons, but actual bewilderment at their own blindness. You missed it because you didn't want to see it, Mom, because seeing it would have meant acknowledging that your quiet, responsible daughter had a life and achievements that were bigger than your family drama. The fallout was accelerating beyond anything any of us had anticipated.
What had started as a simple inheritance dispute had become a public referendum on respect for military service, family loyalty, and the price of taking people for granted. The court date was 1 week away, but the real battle was already over. My family had lost the war of public opinion so decisively that even their expensive lawyers were advising them to settle quietly and hope the media attention faded. But I wasn't interested in quiet settlements anymore. I wanted my day in court, my moment of public vindication, my chance to stand in uniform before a federal judge and let everyone see exactly who they'd been fighting. The escalation phase was complete. Now came the reckoning. The Monday before the court hearing, everything fell apart for my family in ways that would have been laughable if they weren't so predictable. It started with Diego losing his construction job, but not for the reasons anyone expected. His foreman, Mike Torino, was a 20-year Army veteran who'd been following the story in the local papers. When Diego showed up to work Monday morning, Mike was waiting for him with a pink slip and an expression that could have frozen the Chesapeake Bay. "Diego, I got a question for you," Mike said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in Afghanistan. "Is it true that you and your sister have been publicly questioning Admiral Valdez's military credentials?" Diego tried to deflect. "Mike, that's family business. It doesn't have anything to do with work." "Wrong answer," Mike replied. "See, I looked up Admiral Valdez over the weekend. Turns out she commanded the ship that evacuated American civilians from Lebanon in 2019. My nephew was one of those civilians. So when I hear that her own brother is calling her a liar about her military service, that becomes my business." Diego was fired on the spot. Not for poor performance, not for missing work, but for what Mike called conduct incompatible with company values. The construction company employed 15 veterans across 3 counties, and word had spread that Diego Castillo was the guy whose sister was a Navy admiral, and he'd been publicly disrespecting her service. Carmen's situation was even worse. Her part-time job at Morrison's insurance agency had become untenable after clients started asking uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, the agency owner, had 3 sons in the military and a very low tolerance for what she considered unpatriotic behavior. "Carmen, I've been getting calls all week," Mrs. Morrison said during what Carmen later described to Mom as the most humiliating conversation of my life. "Clients are asking if it's true that my employee has been publicly attacking a Navy admiral. They're asking if they want their insurance handled by someone who doesn't support the military." Carmen tried to explain that it was just a family misunderstanding, that the media had blown things out of proportion. Mrs. Morrison's response was swift and final. "Carmen, I don't care if she's your sister or the Queen of England. Admiral Valdez has earned respect that you clearly don't understand. I can't have someone working here who publicly questions the integrity of flag officers. Clean out your desk." By Tuesday evening, both Diego and Carmen were unemployed, unemployable in a town where military respect ran deep, and facing the financial reality that they'd burned bridges with the one family member who'd always bailed them out. But the personal consequences were just the beginning. The Millbrook Heights Town Council held an emergency session Tuesday night to address what Councilman Roberto Vega called the public relations crisis created by the Castillo family's treatment of Admiral Valdez. The meeting was standing room only, filled with veterans, military families, and residents who'd become increasingly uncomfortable with their town being associated with disrespect towards military service. Mrs. Pacheco stood up during public comments and delivered a statement that summarized the community's feelings perfectly. "I've lived in this town for 30 years. I've watched Elena and Roberto Castillo raise their children, and I've watched those children grow up to be adults. But I've also watched Elena's daughter, Reyna, serve this country with honor for over 20 years, and I've watched her family ignore her achievements like they didn't matter. Now they're surprised that the rest of us notice when they publicly disrespect a woman who spent her life protecting our freedoms." The applause was sustained and pointed. Councilman Vega followed up with a motion to formally recognize Admiral Valdez's service and to declare that Millbrook Heights stands with all military families, especially our own. The motion passed unanimously, which meant my family was now living in a town that had officially taken sides against them. Wednesday brought news that hit Diego where it hurt most. The VFW post where Dad had been a member for 15 years voted to suspend his membership pending review of family conduct regarding military service members. Dad, who'd served 2 years in the Army during peacetime and had built much of his social life around the VFW, was devastated. The suspension wasn't permanent, but the message was clear. The veteran community didn't tolerate family members who publicly attacked active duty flag officers, regardless of the circumstances. Thursday's development was the most serious yet. James Morrison, Diego and Carmen's expensive Richmond lawyer, called an emergency meeting to inform them that he was withdrawing from the case.
"I have been practicing law for 25 years, Morrison told them, according to Carmen's later phone call to Mom. "I've never had a case where my client's position was so legally sound, but so morally indefensible that I couldn't represent them effectively." Morrison explained that no jury in Virginia would rule against a Navy admiral whose own family had publicly questioned her integrity. No judge would look favorably on siblings who demonstrated such obvious ignorance about their sister's military achievements. And no legal strategy could overcome the public relations disaster they'd created for themselves. "You're not wrong about your inheritance rights," Morrison told them, "but you're so wrong about everything else that being legally correct doesn't matter anymore." Morrison's withdrawal left them scrambling to find new representation 3 days before the court hearing. Every attorney they contacted in Richmond had the same response. They'd seen the media coverage, they understood the case, and they weren't interested in representing clients who'd made themselves public pariahs. By Friday, they were back to Mr. Patterson, the small-town lawyer who'd started this whole mess, and who was now openly regretting his involvement. Patterson called Rebecca Stone Friday afternoon with a desperate plea for settlement negotiations. "Miss Stone, my clients are prepared to accept Admiral Valdez's offer to purchase their shares at market value. They'd like to resolve this matter quietly, without further court proceedings." Rebecca's response was professional but firm. "Mr. Patterson, that offer expired when your clients chose to make this a public dispute. Admiral Valdez will see you in court Monday morning." What my family hadn't understood was that this had stopped being about money or property weeks ago. This was about respect, recognition, and the price of taking someone for granted for decades. They wanted a quiet settlement that would let them slink away and pretend none of this had happened. I wanted my day in court. Friday evening, Mom called with desperation in her voice that I'd never heard before. "Mija, please, can't we just settle this privately? Diego and Carmen have learned their lesson. They understand now that they were wrong about you." "Have they, Mom? Have they really learned their lesson? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they've learned that there are consequences for their actions, but I haven't heard anyone acknowledge that they spent 23 years dismissing my career." "They're sorry, Reyna. They're both sorry." "Sorry they got caught, Mom. Sorry they're facing consequences. But I haven't heard anyone say they're sorry for treating me like my career didn't matter." The truth was that their apologies, if they ever came, wouldn't change anything now. The damage was done. The community had taken sides, and the military establishment was watching to see how this played out. A quiet settlement would send the message that flag officers could be publicly disrespected by their own families without consequences. That wasn't a message the Navy wanted to send, and it wasn't a message I was willing to accept. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. After decades of being invisible, overlooked, and underestimated, I was finally going to stand in a federal courtroom in full dress uniform and let everyone see exactly who they'd been fighting. The unraveling was complete. My family had lost their jobs, their community standing, their legal representation, and their dignity.
All that remained was the final reckoning, and I intended to make it memorable. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything feel sharp and clear. I'd been awake since 0500, going through my morning routine with the precision of someone preparing for a mission. Dress blue uniform pressed to perfection, ribbons and decorations arranged exactly according to regulation, shoes polished to a mirror shine that could blind aircraft. I wasn't just getting dressed. I was putting on armor. The federal courthouse in Norfolk was buzzing with more activity than a typical Monday morning property dispute would warrant. Rebecca Stone had warned me that word of the hearing had spread through military and legal circles, but I hadn't expected the crowd of observers, reporters, and curious onlookers gathered outside the building. "Admiral," said Rebecca as we walked up the courthouse steps, "this is bigger than either of us anticipated. Half the flag officers in Norfolk seem to have cleared their schedules for this morning." She was right. I recognized faces from the Pentagon, from Norfolk Naval Base, from commands across the Tideway region. Admiral Patricia Harrison was there, along with Captain Rodriguez from the USS Hampton, and at least 6 other senior officers I'd served with over the years. The military community had come to witness what they saw as a test case for how civilian courts handled disrespect towards flag officers. Inside the courtroom, my family sat at the plaintiff's table, looking like they were attending their own execution. Diego wore a cheap suit that didn't fit properly and kept tugging at his collar like it was choking him. Carmen had opted for funeral black, as if mourning the family relationships she was about to lose forever. Mom and Dad sat in the gallery behind them, Dad's face gray with exhaustion, and Mom clutching a tissue like a lifeline. Mr. Patterson shuffled papers nervously at the plaintiff's table, clearly overwhelmed by the attention and the caliber of legal representation across the aisle. Rebecca Stone sat beside me in a power suit that announced she belonged in this courtroom, surrounded by law clerks and paralegals who'd prepared for this moment, like they were arguing before the Supreme Court. Judge Morrison entered at precisely 9:00 hours, and the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Morrison was a former Navy JAG officer himself, appointed to the federal bench after a distinguished military legal career.
This court will now hear the matter of Castillo et al. Versus Valdez regarding disputed inheritance of real property, Judge Morrison announced. Counsel for the plaintiffs, you may proceed. Mr. Patterson stood up on shaky legs and delivered what was possibly the most uncomfortable opening statement in legal history. He outlined the basic facts of the inheritance dispute, Diego and Carmen's desire to sell the property, and my refusal to consent to the sale. But he conspicuously avoided mentioning anything about my military service or the public controversy that had surrounded the case. It was a smart strategy, legally speaking. Stick to the property law, avoid the public relations nightmare they'd created for themselves. Unfortunately for Mr. Patterson, Rebecca Stone had no intention of letting them off that easily. "Your Honor," Rebecca began when her turn came, "this case is indeed about property law, but it's also about something much more fundamental. It's about a family's systematic dismissal of their daughter's achievements, their public questioning of her integrity, and their apparent belief that military service is somehow less valuable than civilian pursuits." She gestured toward me, sitting in my dress uniform with 2 decades of ribbons and decorations visible to everyone in the courtroom. Rear Admiral Valdez has dedicated her life to serving this country. She has commanded ships, led international operations, and earned the respect of military leaders around the world. Yet her own family has spent the past month publicly suggesting that she is lying about her military rank and achievements. Judge Morrison's expression darkened. As a former military officer, he understood exactly what Rebecca was saying. Questioning an officer's credentials wasn't just disrespectful, it was an attack on the entire military hierarchy. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Morrison said, "is it true that your clients have publicly questioned Admiral Valdez's military credentials?" Patterson looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Your Honor, there may have been some
misunderstandings about my client's awareness of Admiral Valdez's achievements. Misunderstandings. Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms and command positions. Mr. Patterson, I've read the newspaper coverage of this case. Your clients didn't just misunderstand their sister's rank, they actively disputed it in public forums. That's when the moment I'd been waiting for finally arrived. The bailiff, following Rebecca's prearranged script, announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom, "Admiral Reyna Valdez has arrived." The effect was electric. Judge Morrison immediately stood and rendered a sharp military salute, recognizing my flag rank according to military protocol. Every active duty and former military person in the courtroom followed suit, creating a wave of recognition that swept through the gallery. My family's faces went through a progression of emotions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Confusion, as people around them stood and saluted. Realization, as they understood that this wasn't theater. This was real military protocol being observed for a real flag officer. And finally, horror, as they grasped that they'd been publicly fighting someone whose rank commanded automatic respect from federal judges and senior military officials. Diego mouth opened. Carmen started crying quietly. Mom looked like she was about to faint. Dad, who'd served briefly in the Army decades ago, looked ashamed in a way that went deeper than embarrassment. "Admiral Valdez," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying newfound respect, "please approach the bench." I stood and walked forward with the bearing of someone who'd briefed admirals and congressmen, who'd commanded ships through hostile waters, who'd earned every stripe and star on my uniform. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of my dress shoes on the polished floor. "Admiral, I want to ensure that this court treats your service with the respect it deserves," Judge Morrison said. "Before we proceed with property law, I need to address the elephant in the room. Have your family members publicly questioned your military credentials?" "Yes, Your Honor, they have." "And are you indeed a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy?" "Yes, Your Honor. I was promoted to flag rank 3 months ago." Judge Morrison turned to face my family at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Patterson, I need your clients to understand something. Admiral Valdez isn't just their sister. She's a flag officer in the United States Navy, with security clearances and responsibilities that most civilians can't comprehend. The fact that their own family was unaware of her achievements reflects poorly on them, not on her." What followed was 20 minutes of the most one-sided legal proceeding I'd ever witnessed. Rebecca Stone systematically dismantled every argument my family had made, not just legally, but morally. She presented evidence of their financial desperation, their history of relying on my support, and their complete ignorance of my military career. More importantly, she presented character witnesses. Admiral Harrison testified about my leadership during international crises. Captain Rodriguez described operations I'd led that had prevented armed conflicts. Commander Mitchell explained the level of trust and responsibility that came with flag rank. By the time Rebecca finished, it was clear that this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about a family that had spent decades taking for granted someone who deserved their respect and recognition. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Not only did he uphold my right to purchase my siblings' shares and prevent the sale, but he issued a formal reprimand that would become part of the public record. This court finds that the plaintiffs have demonstrated a pattern of disrespect toward military service that reflects poorly on their character and credibility, he said. Admiral Valdez has earned a right to preserve her family's property, and she has certainly earned the right to be treated with dignity by her own relatives. As we left the courthouse, the crowd of military personnel formed an impromptu honor guard. Admiral Harrison shook my hand and said, "Admiral, the Navy is proud of how you handled the situation. You showed exactly the kind of grace under pressure that makes flag officers." My family followed behind at a distance, looking like mourners at their own funeral. The reporters who'd covered the story were already writing the headlines I'd see the next morning. Navy Admiral prevails over family's disrespect, and federal judge sides with military honor. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the moment I stopped hiding who I was to protect other people's feelings. It was in choosing dignity over family harmony, respect over quiet compliance. 6 months later, I was serving as Deputy Commander of the Pacific Fleet, stationed in Pearl Harbor. I sent my family Christmas cards with my new address, but I didn't invite them to visit. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes. The house in Millbrook Heights was renovated and turned into a bed and breakfast that I named Valdez House in honor of my grandfather. It hosts military families and veterans, people who understand the value of service and sacrifice. Diego and Carmen eventually found new jobs in other towns where their names weren't associated with disrespecting flag officers. Mom and Dad moved to a smaller place closer to Mom's sister in North Carolina. We exchange holiday cards and birthday wishes, but the relationship is polite and distant. The lesson I learned isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about the price of making yourself small to accommodate other people's comfort. For 23 years, I'd hidden my achievements to protect my family's egos. The moment I stopped protecting them from the truth about who I was, everything changed. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be invisible anymore. Sometimes the greatest victory is just standing up and letting people see exactly who you've always been. And sometimes justice looks like a federal judge saluting you while your family finally understands what they've been too blind to see all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.